I would now like to invite Gillian White from the Ontario Trillium Foundation to give us her view on some of these topics as well.
Thank you. Okay, so I shall share my screen and introduce you to my headshot, which looks much better than my work from home look. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we at OTF have been trying to use data available to really kind of ground the decisions that we make about how to continue to serve the sector as things change. My subtitle is "or trying to and learning some lessons," because we, as we become a bit more, I think, day-to-day reliant on data to help point us in the right direction, we're realizing where some of those shortcomings are. And I'll kind of end with like some thoughts on where we could go, or at least where OTF is trying to go. So just a little background, I think most people are familiar with the Ontario Trillium Foundation. So we're an agency of the Government of Ontario. Depending on the year, we grant between 100 and 120 million to the nonprofit and charitable sector. This is through two funds. So we have our community investments, which is through the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, Culture Industries. And that's our larger fund. It would be between like 80 and 95 million a year. And then we also have our Youth Opportunities Fund, which is focused on funding and supporting grassroots organizations that are particularly either working with Indigenous or Black youth, or organizations led by Indigenous and Black communities for the youth of their communities. So OTF's mission is to build healthy and vibrant communities throughout Ontario by investing in community-based initiatives and strengthening the impact of Ontario's nonprofit sector. As Marcel kind of alluded to, we are that government body that doesn't have as much flexibility to really radically change our granting. We have to be kind of within the confines of our MOU with the government. So we have to fund organizations that have a direct impact in their communities. They need to be incorporated as a registered charity or nonprofit for at least a year. We have some financial eligibility, and we need to have up-to-date records included with applications. They have to operate in Ontario, have more than 3 board members. And again, as Marcel was talking about operational funding, we do fund projects, or we did prior to COVID. Municipalities under 20,000 people are eligible, generally speaking, for our funds, but the MUSH sector is not. We have some structures and processes in place where we do kind of try and decentralize the way that we fund grants. So we have now 6 different regions, 17 catchments across those 7 regions that each have their own grant review teams and their own dedicated staff. So the program managers at OTF would review the applications that would then go to the volunteers for that catchment, which would then go to these grant review teams at each deadline. They make the recommendations, that goes to the board. The board approves those grants, and then it goes to the ministry for announcements. So the reason I say this is because some of what I would consider the best practices in granting, including operational funding, including rolling deadlines, including things like being really flexible and doing things as quickly as possible. We have some kind of structural things in place that make that really difficult for OTF. So speed really is not our strong suit, but we do have quite broad reach. So that's kind of the trade-off. We are a large grantor, but we can't pivot quite as quickly as some of the smaller foundations. Prior to COVID, we had a 10-year investment strategy where we were investing in 6 different action areas: active people, connected people, green people, inspired people, promising young people, and prosperous people. We granted to these 6 different action areas through 3 different types of grants. So we had seed grants, which were under 25,000 for kind of proof of concept type of things. Grow grants, which were much larger. They were over up to 3 years and up to $750,000. Those really needed to be evidence-based, and the intention was really to kind of scale things that had been had a good strong evidence base for being proven effective types of work in the community. And then we had capital grants. So we have prior to COVID, we are guilty of some of those things that I think a lot of grantees don't love. Things like extensive reporting. We had a more involved application process. So some of those things that were kind of like pretty persistent throughout, I think, funders across the nonprofit and charitable sector. So this is kind of like, this is where we were, you know, like 15 months ago, or even 12 months ago. With the onset of COVID, there was, I would say, like, obviously the organization goes, okay, well, what do we do now? How are our grantees going to be impacted? What should we do with kind of like our upcoming granting programs? You know, initially, I think like everybody, we thought it would be a matter of weeks or at the most a couple of months that we would be dealing with COVID. And I think as that became clear over kind of the first 3 weeks of the pandemic, that this was something that was going to be really much more foundationally disruptive to our lives, our societies, and the sector that we were serving, that we really needed to make a strong change to how we were granting. We would have to reallocate I think we had 84 million left in our annual granting budget. So that's where, you know, people don't love surveys until they want your data to make some decisions. So we had the organization looking to our measurement team asking, what should we do? Where should we put this money? And, you know, what's happening in the sector? So we kind of broke it down into 3 broad research questions to help us get at these kind of the 2 at the bottom, which was ultimately, we want to know, like, how do we invest to have the greatest impact with the context of COVID-19, and how do we measure recovery of the sector from COVID-19? So those 3 research questions were kind of 3 different, I like to think of them as like kind of Zooms. So we needed to know what was going on in the communities that the nonprofit sector serves. We wanted to know how the organizations themselves were being impacted. And then we wanted to know also what funders were doing, so that we weren't all reacting to the same kind of, you know, organizational or community data in the same way and maybe missing some gaps. So for this first question, we really had a hard time answering this. And I would say, like, ultimately, we still are not really able to answer this question. We kind of collected things from a hodgepodge. So we were also trying to do this over quite a short period of time, I would say last April or May. We used, that should be the ONN flash survey, as well as the state of the sector survey, to look at which subsectors we're seeing an increase in demand, and kind of using that as a proxy for the impacts in the community or the community need. We also reached out to some partners at 201 to ask like if they had seen any change in the type of requests or calls that they were getting, to get a sense of what the community directly was reaching out for. And then we were really trying to lean on organizations that we had existing relationships with, either organizations or partners of ours or other funders, to find out if they had any surveys in the field, or if they had anything that they could share from their constituents, to kind of give us a sense of what they were hearing from their communities, for us to be able to kind of see what was most prevalent, and if we could make any sense of it. And then just general media or news articles. So I think it's no surprise to anybody looking at the sector surveys, we found that social services and health sectors were really the ones that were seeing a huge increase in demand. Food security, food banks, they were really, really strained, especially towards the beginning of the pandemic. Domestic violence was something that came up as an issue that was exacerbated by the impacts of COVID-19 or the stay-at-home orders, as well as just generally across the communities. We were seeing greater social isolation, physical inactivity, mental health. These were things that we were seeing come up both anecdotally and in survey findings. But ultimately, to answer this question, we really weren't able to. So ultimately, when we started looking at how we were going to pivot our funding, this wasn't a very good, we didn't have anything really strong to base any changes or use this in any real instructive way. So we looked to somewhere that we could get a little bit better sense of the data with a bit more fulsome kind of sources. So this was looking at the the impact of COVID-19 on the sector or on organizations and how they were able to operate. We worked with ONN and AFO to put out a survey in the field in June. We were able to collect 1,131 responses, which was great. So these, I can go through a couple of the stats and some of our findings. I think most people would be familiar with this. The couple caveats to this is that it is a convenient sample, so it wasn't representative. And we didn't really have any way to ensure that we were getting the voice of like small grassroots, rural, or kind of organizations that weren't already kind of in the, not necessarily the inner circle, but were connected to us. So they may be underrepresented in these survey findings. And kind of ultimately what we found were that for the most part, the nonprofit sector continued to find a way to serve their constituents. That almost 60% had adapted to virtual within the first 3 months of the pandemic. But that this wasn't necessarily the case across the board. So certain subsectors had a harder time by virtue of just like the nature of their programming. So arts and culture and sport and rec really had a harder time adapting to virtual. So less than half of those organizations were able to actually adapt their programs to virtual. And we were also seeing really much higher rates of closure or temporary closure compared to the other subsectors. Virtually across the board, organizations were impacted financially. The outlook was pretty poor. There were 1 in 5 saying that they didn't think they could last 6 more months. And what we took away from this at OTF was that the need was pretty ubiquitous, like across the sector. Organizations really were feeling this financially. But the financial hit at this time wasn't gigantic for each organization. So if we could get money out quickly and kind of into as many hands as possible, that would hopefully support kind of the resilience and the rebuilding of the sector. So from that survey, we found that the average loss per organization was about 123,000. So the majority of organizations were experiencing losses under 100K. And with 84 million left in our funding budget, we could hopefully get, as much reach as possible across the sector. We also saw that not all organizations were experiencing this the same in terms of demand. So we saw that social services, health and development, and housing really were seeing a higher increase in demand than things like the arts and culture and sports and rec sectors that weren't able to kind of, were less of one of those basic services in the sector. So all of this to say, in May, our granting team and kind of an interdepartmental group got together to go through a sprint exercise to basically go, okay, well, with this data that we have available, what are we going to do? We wanted to reduce the admin burden as much as possible. So we do have some requirements. We have to make sure that organizations meet our eligibility, but we tried to really streamline that application process as much as possible so that it would be accessible to more of the grassroots and kind of less professionalized organizations. We made our grants relatively small, so under 150K, to try and get to as many organizations as possible. And we felt like that was kind of a good balance to meet what we had seen in the flash survey and the state of the sector survey. We wanted to position ourselves as this being recovery funding. So the outcomes intended for this fund was really at the organization level and was about how they were going to use this money to adapt their organization's either programming or kind of structures to make sure that they were going to be able to kind of weather this. We really didn't think that emergency funding made sense for us because OTF, like I said, speed is not really our strength. And there were a number of other funders that were really trying to meet that kind of emergency funding target. So we also use this as an opportunity to collect data without really overburdening. So we were trying to use the application as kind of a data collection mechanism as well, without overburdening with another survey or with additional kind of data collection intentions. So we asked about the impacts of COVID-19, which we were able to segregate then by region, demographic, and subsector. as well as the needs of the organization, which we kind of used the outcomes they were selecting as a surrogate. And then we will ultimately be collecting this in the final reports as well to be able to kind of use as hopefully a measure of how the sector is recovering. So through this 1 year granting term, where's the sector come? Where are we still falling short? And again, we can do that by region, demographic, and subsector. So this was the Resilience Communities Fund. We've extended it to this upcoming fiscal year as well. So overall, it'll be over $150 million that we will grant to the nonprofit sector. It is OTF standard eligibility, but we've also added the Ontario mandate as an additional catchment, so that we're able to support some of those organizations that don't necessarily operate in one specific region. They're $150,000 grants for a 1 year term, intended to really help organizations make the changes necessary to help them kind of weather this COVID-19 storm. So they can select more than one outcome, but the outcomes that the fund is looking to support are adapting and reimagining programs, procuring equipment to either renovate spaces or do what they need to do to continue programming and abide by, obviously, the public health restrictions. Develop new streams of revenue generation, equip staff and board with new strategies. So this might be like pivoting how they do their work, and then creating new partnerships and collaborations. So from our applications data, we found that the majority of organizations were operating under 70% capacity. That's not surprising. I think probably the biggest takeaway actually from these stats is that there was a gigantic demand. So we had 4,300 applications over two rounds. Our typical application numbers would be around 700 prior to COVID. Our highest, I think, was about 1,000. So to see 1,600 applications in one round, and then I think 2,600 in the next round, it was really the need across sectors was really evident. And we were seeing organizations that had never applied for OTF funding before. So either that speaks to kind of the more general nature of the fund, or that there was just like such demand in the sector that we were seeing people kind of come from all over. Not surprisingly, most of what we found from the application data collection aligned with the ONN State of the Sector survey. We were finding that organizations were really struggling to generate revenue, to meet demands for services, and to deliver their program and deliver on their mission. And most organizations, speaking to kind of that resilience, were trying to adapt their programs to be able to continue programming and serving their communities throughout the pandemic. From the budget breakdown we were seeing, for the most part, we were really supporting either salaries of existing staff or consultants, so purchase services, as well as capital. So this is kind of what it looks like at OTF. We have a number of different dashboards that help us kind of slice and dice. We also have another one looking at our assessments to start to see where we are funding and where maybe we're not funding as much. And then that goes to the granting team to change, not necessarily like the structure of the fund, but it might change how we do outreach or that kind of thing, or look at some of our policies or how we're enacting our policies in our assessments. So this is just an idea of kind of like what data looks like at OTF and how much we really do use it a lot. We try to make it as accessible as possible for our granting team and our senior leadership. So our takeaways from this were really, there's a gigantic need for funding. Generating revenue is still a huge challenge. And there are some organizations, especially those that are serving what we would call like priority populations, that are experiencing kind of this trifecta of increased demand, increased expenses, and reduced revenue. We also saw that a lot of organizations were having kind of an existential crisis that was leaving them unable to deliver on their mission. So a lot of organizations were selecting delivering on their mission, just being able to do what they exist to do. And this wasn't the same across all sectors, but we were definitely seeing this for some of them that weren't able to pivot their programming as well. We were trying to provide funds as quickly as possible with as few restrictions and as few strings attached as possible, but just given some of the constraints that we have because of our MOU, it's not always possible, but it's definitely something that I would recommend to other funders. And I think I'm just kind of reiterating what Marcel was saying. But also without better sector data, we really have a hard time of understanding who isn't getting funding and who isn't applying. Which brings me to kind of this last piece, which is how are funders responding? Or I think what I was supposed to be talking about in this presentation was what's the role of funders in rebuilding? And I mean, from where I sit as the Director of Measurement, Evaluation, and Business Intelligence, I come back to data and providing data, providing both the mechanisms and the tools for data to be collected as well as used by the sector. I think I'm close to time here. So I can speak to what we're trying to do to kind of address this or to make steps forward on this at OTF. We're really trying to improve our use of community data. The difficulty is that it's not very easily accessible and the mechanisms of collection are slow. So things like the census that happen every 4 years, it's kind of hard to see like what emergent needs there are from community when we're not going to see necessarily in real time the impact of COVID-19 on community needs, like which we would take from like income or housing or that kind of thing. So our first step at OTF is just to, we're working with another group to create a dashboard that just is a map of demographics across Ontario. So it's an interactive map that we're able to toggle between different kind of granularity geographically to then see kind of what the proportional population is of our different priority demographics. So if we're looking at how we have funded organizations serving the Black community, we need to know what the size of that Black community is in a particular region because we do fund all over Ontario. We're also trying to improve the data that we have related to the sector. So we've been using our RCF applications and we will be using our final reports as well as much as possible, but that only tells us about the organizations that are in touch with OTF. So without some kind of common repository or mechanism, it makes it pretty difficult. But so we've really been leaning on kind of the reports coming out of either ONN, which we're working with them, and then also Imagine Canada. But we really need something to just tell us who's in the sector. So right now we don't really have a good idea of who's even out there. And kind of to be able to look at recovery, it's hard to say when you kind of have a moving target or you're building on moving, on shifting land. So what we are hoping to do, but is still very much in the works, is build a mapping tool of the organizations in the sector. So what they do, who they serve, and where they work. Basically those kind of three aspects with, again, an ability to toggle between different granularity of region. And then funder data. So this is one that we actually like, for the most part, funders have data.
Yeah, I can ask you to just sort of finish up the presentations as we're a bit over time at this point.
Yep, this is my last point.
Okay.
So this is data that we have, and we actually just need to share it, or we at least need to have some kind of common data standard to be able to bring it into a place that we can use each other's data. So we aren't working in silos, which sounds so cliche, but it really is true that we collect data for our own purposes, which is generally not exactly the same as under other funders, but it's pretty close, or it's close enough that we could really probably reduce the burden of collection, but also we could probably work towards starting to coordinate a little bit if we were able to just do a little bit better job of just sharing data and kind of coordinating how we collect data and what we use it for. All right, that's it from me.